Good day. Today is Saturday, 5th July 2025, and today I can say that following a political crisis in Britain, in which it appeared that Prime Minister Keir Starmer's position as British Prime Minister was hanging by a thread, he has finally taken decisive and resolute action, no doubt to shore up his position. This decisive and resolute action consists of another meeting in London with his friend Emmanuel Macron of the so-called Coalition of the Willing to discuss what further measures can be taken to help and assist President Zelensky and Ukraine. This continues to be, quite obviously, at this time, the Prime Minister's continued overriding priority. You might think that the emerging financial crisis in Britain, the disappearance of fiscal headroom, as it's sometimes referred to, the fact that his Chancellor has been reduced to tears in debates in the House of Commons, the fact that his parliamentary party is turning against him, the fact that there's growing criticism across the country of the fact that he is spending too much time on foreign policy, that he's acting as his own foreign minister. What has happened to the actual foreign minister? David Lammy is a good question. We barely see him anymore. Anyway, one might have thought that these were the things that the Prime Minister at this absolutely critical moment would prioritise. Not at all. Apparently, he's now busy rolling out the red carpet for Emmanuel Macron. He's going to have him back in London. The two are going to have meetings. There's going to be more discussions and meetings with the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Presumably, these will take the form of virtual conferences, because I've not heard of other leaders from across Europe coming to Britain, though I might be entirely wrong about that. But anyway, there will be further meetings. Perhaps, quite probably, Zelensky himself will be there. Perhaps, quite probably, Starmer will embrace him. Anyway, all of that seems to be the priority that the Prime Minister has at the moment. Now, I say that, of course, there will be people who will immediately push back. They will say correctly that this meeting was convened and scheduled some time ago, that given that Macron was coming to London anyway, it would have been impossible and indeed incredibly offensive and might even deepen the sense of crisis if, say, Starmer had put off the meeting in order to focus instead on the developing domestic crisis in London. All of that would be true. But then, of course, there are things that can be done in these kind of situations to at least limit or reduce the Prime Minister's profile in these events. He could quite properly say that though he is going to meet with Macron, he could hardly do otherwise. As to the actual sessions that would be taking place during the so-called Coalition of the Willing meeting, because of the problems back home, he is obliged to delegate the actual day-to-day arrangements, the conversations, to his two admittedly incompetent ministers, the Defence Minister, Mr. Healey, and the Foreign Minister, Mr. Lammy. He could do that, but there's no sign, no indication at the moment that the Prime Minister has any indication, any inclination to do any of these things. He apparently intends to take as active and as busy a role in this issue as ever. The single-mindedness with which Keir Starmer focuses on Ukraine is truly remarkable. as I've said in previous programs, it has always appeared to me that this is the one major issue that he is most engaged in, far more than all others. The fact that there are no parties signing up to his peacekeeping force in Ukraine, the fact that the Americans have shown no enthusiasm for it, the fact that the Russians have rejected it completely, the fact that ideas of establishing European no-fly zones over Western Ukraine, that those have all quietly been buried and put away. The fact that Britain is out of air defence missiles and out of self-propelled howitzers, and that the military itself is in a critical position. The fact that the Americans are pulling back. None of that seems to deter him any more than the concerns expressed both by his own ministers, by his officials, by the members of the House of Commons, including now a substantial part of his own party. He is unfazed, apparently, by the fact that he's increasingly being called never hear Kiev. None of this bothers him. He's going to continue and focus single-mindedly on the question of Ukraine. Well, there we go. The one thing I will advise Keir Starmer to think about, and to think about very carefully, is that back in 1990, a prime minister with a far more solid reputation and grip on power, or so it seemed, than his own, Margaret Thatcher, is widely believed to have lost a leadership contest that was playing out in Westminster, because she chose instead, whilst that leadership contest was playing out, to attend an EU meeting from memory in Brussels. She discovered that as a result, MPs who might have been won over to her side, had she been in London and been there to speak to them, instead sided with her opponent, Michael Heseltine, so that she failed to win a majority in the first round of the leadership election that was playing out in the House of Commons amongst her parliamentary party. And that set in train a sequence of events which within a few hours, days from at best from my recollection, resulted in her being forced to resign. Now, I'm not saying that Keir Starmer is yet in that position. After the events of the last couple of weeks, he still has, I think, residual support within his cabinet. And as I've discussed in previous programs, there is no obvious alternative to him to take over, though the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, is clearly starting to position herself to do that. But still, what happened to Margaret Thatcher could conceivably be done to him. I would have thought that it would be very unwise for him to devote as much time as he is doing to Ukrainian matters at this particular time. And my own view is that it reinforces the sense that this is a prime minister who has completely lost touch, not just with the domestic realities of the country that he is governing, but with the political realities in Westminster and Whitehall as well. Well, that's all I'm going to say about Keir Starmer. As to the meeting of the coalition of the willing, I've lost count how many of those have taken place by now. It should be obvious, one would have thought, by this point that this whole project is a total irrelevance, but Starmer and Macron and presumably Zelensky nonetheless choose to persist with it. Probably Macron has a little bit more of an understanding of the realities. He's, after all, called Putin over the course of the last week, and no doubt he will be briefing Starmer and whoever else bothers to attend this meeting about the results of his conversation with Putin. But as it's clear that Putin didn't give an inch, I'm not sure what exactly it is that he has to convey, at least on the question of Ukraine. Starmer himself, of course, shows no sign of calling Putin, no interest in doing so. He remains as fixated with supporting Zelensky as ever. Anyway, let's move on and discuss perhaps more serious topics, more relevant topics to the ones that are actually taking place. Now, yesterday, as I discussed, there was a telephone conversation or the day before yesterday, in fact, a conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I've gone through the rather extensive commentary that the Russians have provided about that meeting, care of Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. I've also commented about Donald Trump's admission that he'd found the call with Putin extremely disappointing. It's clear that Trump again asked Putin to agree to a ceasefire, and Putin spoke defiantly and said, no, not at all, not in any way in the present conditions. The stop on the delivery of a certain classes of weapons to Ukraine, no more than a pause, is nowhere near enough. We are going to continue with the special military operation until its objectives are achieved. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, by the way, has been speaking further about this. He says that Putin told Trump that in the present state of the negotiations, there continues to be a huge gulf between the Russian and Ukrainian sides, and that this makes it inappropriate to talk about ceasefires or anything like that. The Russians are not going to shift on this position, and until the Ukrainians do, there is no sense in talking about ceasefires. Trump, as I said, came away bitterly disappointed from this call, by his own admission, though he was careful to say nothing about the call on Truth Social. Now, when I made my program yesterday, I said that Trump was also, over the course of yesterday, going to speak to Zelensky and to Friedrich Merz. Merz now being the most substantive advocate of Ukraine in Europe. He is the person who continues to insist on Ukraine being provided with weapons and money and those kind of things. And he is also, incidentally, now becoming the most belligerent leader amongst the big European states in talking about Russia. And I spoke yesterday in my program about how the Ukrainians were nonplussed, or say they were nonplussed, by the decision by the United States to stop further supplies, especially of Patriot missile interceptors, but also of certain other categories of weapons. The Ukrainians insist that they weren't informed about this in advance. They say, though it has been denied by the administration, that they found out about it from the media. I don't believe them, by the way. And Merz and the Germans now clearly and obviously increasingly alarmed that the United States is beginning to walk away. Also anxiously wanted to speak to Trump to find out whether there might be some workarounds, whether there might be some way of getting the United States to resume supplies of Patriot missile interceptors either to Ukraine or perhaps to Germany, which would in effect be buying those Patriot missile interceptors from Germany on from the United States on Ukraine's behalf. And I said in my program yesterday that though Donald Trump would clearly be very sympathetic to these calls, to these requests from Zelensky and from Merz, ultimately he is not in a position to deliver that which is not there. If the United States is indeed short of Patriot missile interceptors, if indeed there are Patriot missile interceptors of a new category being developed specifically to deal with the challenge of hypersonic missiles, which cannot be supplied to Ukraine because that might expose certain technologies which the Chinese and the Russians would then discover, then Donald Trump is simply not in a position to reverse that decision. And to anticipate what I'm going to say further, the reports show that that is exactly what happened. Trump was very sympathetic to Zelensky. Trump was very sympathetic to Merz. You could see that with Zelensky, he held out the metaphorical handkerchief to Zelensky as Zelensky sobbed about the enormous missile and drone attacks that are taking place against Ukraine and specifically against Kiev every day now. He told Zelensky that the United States would indeed work with him to see what could be done about strengthening air defense systems. He told Merz that the United States would indeed be looking at some point to resume Patriot missile deliveries. He said the same, by the way, to the media today. Trump has actually spoken to the media. He's admitted that the situation with Ukraine is extremely tough. Clearly communicating his very deep frustration about the situation. He also said that the United States might in some form eventually look to supply Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine. But, and this is key, all of the reports confirm that neither in the call to Zelensky nor in the call to Merz, and certainly not in the comments that he made to the media, did Donald Trump say that the United States would be supplying Patriot missile interceptors now or give any timetable for when they would be supplied. Now, there has inevitably been some pushback in the United States. NBC published a report yesterday based on information from our old friends, the anonymous sources, 3 of them allegedly, that the decision to stop the transfer of weapons to Ukraine, these weapons to Ukraine, was made, well, apparently not by Elbridge Colby after all, but by Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary. And he did this entirely acting on his own. He didn't inform anyone else in the administration. He didn't inform Marco Rubio at the State Department. It's not clear whether he discussed it with the president. He just, by himself, apparently, decided one morning that the United States would stop supplying Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine, despite apparently reports from various American military officials who assured him that, in fact, even though, yes, it's true, there have been a significant reduction in American missile stockpiles, Nonetheless, the situation is far from critical. There is still enough to give to Ukraine. Anyway, that is a story that's now appearing in NBC. There'll be other stories like this. I said yesterday that there would be people, and in fact there already are people. There are people in Britain, Owen Matthews in the Daily Telegraph, Hamish de Bretton Gordon in the Guardian, other commentators in the London Times, by the way, and in the Guardian as well. Just to say, there's been some complaints, justified complaints, about the fact that I report so much on articles that appear in the Daily Telegraph. Let me make it clear that I have no personal liking of the Daily Telegraph at all. In fact, I have personal history with them, which would explain why I would like them even less. But the reason I do go to the Daily Telegraph is because, as I have long since discovered on foreign policy issues, the Daily Telegraph reports and publishes the opinions of the British establishment in their purest, most complete, most distilled form. If you want to know what the British establishment, the permanent state in Whitehall is thinking, I'm not saying everybody within it, but the ascendant majority within it. If you want to know what they're thinking, the Daily Telegraph, in my experience, over the last few years, has been the place to go. Suffice to say that it is also the newspaper where no less a person than Keir Starmer and some of his ministers also nowadays write their pieces. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, there's recently been a cluster of articles there which also call into question whether the United States is, or indeed can be, as short of Patriot missile interceptors as it says. For some of these people, as I said before, it is conceptually impossible that the United States could ever run out of weapons. It is something that is so alien to their own understanding of what the United States, the so-called arsenal of democracy, is that they just cannot compute it. And of course, others who perhaps do have a better understanding of it are nonetheless challenging it because, well, they don't like the present president of the United States. They don't like the administration of the United States. They are deeply suspicious of the various steps the president has taken to try to normalize relations with Russia. And for all of these reasons, they want to criticize him and to undermine him. And by the way, I believe the story in NBC is basically all about that. To go back to that piece, this was a decision made apparently in the early part of June, which has been quietly working its way through the decision-making process. It is inconceivable that Donald Trump wasn't himself consulted. I think it is extremely unlikely that Marco Rubio, who himself admitted back in March in congressional testimony that the United States was out of Patriot missile interceptors, he said that in public, and you can find the footage, the film in which he said it. I think it is inconceivable that Marco Rubio, who also doubles now as National Security Advisor, was not informed about this. As I've discussed in many programs, those who followed us on the Duran, who followed my programs, who've been listening to Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, would know that we would eventually come to this point, and we now have. Anybody with any doubts about this, incidentally, can also go back and look at what is happening in the skies over Ukraine. Every night now, pretty much, the Russians are launching hundreds of drones and missiles at Ukraine. This is becoming a constant, regular pattern, and there is no reason to think that it is ever going to stop. We are no longer in the situation that we were in 2022, 2023, when the Russians launched big missile strikes against Ukraine roughly twice a month. They are now doing it every day during the month. There is hardly a day now when the Russians don't launch some kind of missile or drone strike across Ukraine. This takes place, as I said, on a continuous basis. If the United States tried to stop this by sending to Ukraine more Patriot missile interceptors, the number of Patriot missile interceptors would run out probably within a matter of a few weeks. And obviously, the United States cannot currently entertain that possibility. Anyway, I will return to all of this in more detail later in this program. Anyway, Donald Trump, as I said, he's tried to say comforting things to Merz and to Zelensky. He's promised consultations and further discussions. He's holding out the possibility of more missiles being supplied in the future. And of course, it's important to say that the United States does have an industrial base and it does produce Patriot missiles, though nowhere near enough. I believe it's around 500 a year, 500 to 600 a year. The point is, it cannot do that now. It might be able to resume deliveries in a few weeks or months' time when the inventory has been built up to some extent again. But given the realities of the situation in Ukraine, given the realities of the depletion of the US's stockpile, given the difficulties in production in the United States itself, given also the competing demands that the United States is now facing from Israel, from US forces in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific region, from the US's other allies, any further deliveries that the United States makes of Patriot missile interceptors in the future will of necessity be of very limited quantity and for short durations of time, insufficient in quantity and number to change the situation. Now, on that, I've had an absolutely fascinating and in some ways extremely helpful email from another member of the Duran community who has referred me to a genuinely bizarre article that has recently appeared in the Daily Telegraph. Not in the Daily Telegraph, I apologize, in The Economist. Now, this article actually discusses the difficulties that the United States has in producing weapons. And I should say that the article is full of improbable statistics and indeed fantastic statistics about Ukraine. But it does say things about the United States that do appear to be true. It speaks about the fact that the United States cannot increase the amount of weapons it produces, that there are now fundamental limits on those weapons that the United States is able to produce. It admits very grudgingly that the Russians and the Chinese are in a better position to produce weapons than the United States itself can do. And then it makes a really quite fantastic claim. And you find it in the title. The war in Ukraine shows the West can rearm without reindustrializing. Industrial capacity in peacetime is no longer necessary for success during war. It is taking the thesis of Alex Vershinin at the Royal United Service Institute that we are now looking at the return of industrial war, and it is putting it on its head. It says that nowadays the United States no longer needs to produce huge numbers of weapons in great quantities. It provides a fascinating account of the production line for Abrams tanks, and it admits that the United States is no longer producing any new tanks. It's merely refurbishing old tanks, and that refurbishing an old tank can take literally years. Each refit of a tank takes roughly 2 years. 2 years to refit a tank. Poland ordered a big batch of tanks in 2022, less than 6 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine. It is still waiting for most of them. And this is true in sector after sector of the US's defense industrial system. The United States, as we've seen, cannot produce huge numbers of missiles, not on the scale that the Russians are doing or the Chinese are doing. But then don't worry, that doesn't really matter, because the type of weapons that are produced today are so sophisticated, so advanced, that you only need to have nimble, flexible manufacturing, and you only need to produce them. Well, I'm not sure exactly how this article suggests you can produce them, because as the person who sent me this article pointed out, the article doesn't really explain, it doesn't really solve this mystery, how you can arm yourself with weapons without production. But anyway, it does go on to say that eventually, even without actually producing weapons in any great numbers, you can somehow get round the problem because of the changes in military technology are taking place. Anyway, the example that it cites is Ukraine's drone industry, which of course is all very well, but I've discussed already that drones are not by themselves the only weapon in war. And the article seems oblivious to the fact that according to Ukrainian military commanders now, the situation with drones in Ukraine is starting to become critical. And I've had other explanations from other correspondents as to why that might be so, that without Chinese drones being provided to Ukraine, without Ukraine being in a position to buy Chinese drones that can be modified or cannibalized, presumably for parts, Ukraine is having to rely on Western components, and there is a massive inflation of costs, and there are also problems with supply. But anyway, the article disregards that. It appears to believe that the United States can continue to produce weapons like Ukraine does in cottage factories scattered across Ukraine. It can all be done with 3D printers and things like that in the way that Ukraine does. This apparently is the future of the United States' military industries. And by the way, it also makes some really quite astonishing claims. It says that the United States only produces 40,000 shells a month, which is true. We're talking about 155 millimeter shells. It says that this is a third of the number of shells that Ukraine uses in any month. Now that would average out at around 4,000 shells fired by Ukraine every day. That has been true at various points during the war, but I don't believe it is true now. And then it makes an astonishing claim. It says that Ukraine has produced, is now building 2.4 million shells, artillery shells, a year. I think that's an absolutely fantastic number. I don't believe that has any connection to reality, quite apart from the fact that Ukraine is being shelled and bombed every single day, and that factories, you cannot build shells in vast numbers in small cottage type artisanal factories. You have to establish big production lines for them, and I can't see that Ukraine has anything like that. In fact, the article admits that the big Soviet military industrial plants that Ukraine inherited are now mostly lying idle. I suspect that 2.4 million shells that the article refers to probably derives from the very, very large number of shells that Ukraine received via Turkey from Syrian army stocks. I can easily believe that the Syrian army stockpiled shells on something like that quantity. And of course, Ukraine continues to receive shells from Europe and from other places. And that might mean that over the course of a year, Ukraine did have, large numbers of shells. But I don't believe that it was 2.4 million. And of course, if it was 2.4 million, that would not explain why, in that case, Ukraine is only firing, according to The Economist, just 4,000 shells a day. Just saying. But anyway, it includes fantastic claims like this. But as I said, it still seems to believe that the United States, all can be fine with the United States. It doesn't need to reindustrialize in order to produce weapons. An absurd hypothesis, and one which takes us again back to the problem that the United States is now confronting. In effect, what this article in The Economist is saying is that the U.S. industrial base at the moment is not in a position to provide weapons in huge quantities as it once could, and that is why there is a crisis with air defense missiles and other such weapons currently in Ukraine. And going back again to Trump's conversations with Zelensky and Merz and his statements in the media, it is this procurement crisis, this bottleneck in production, which it will take years to resolve. And by the way, the article in The Economist acknowledges the fact. It is this problem that explains the decision. It's not that Trump doesn't want to supply Ukraine with weapons. Perhaps he doesn't, perhaps he does. The problem is that he doesn't have the weapons currently to give. Anyway, there are other claims being made about the conversation between Zelensky and Trump. And according to these claims, Trump also passed on to Zelensky some of the things that Putin said to Trump when they'd spoken to each other on the previous day. Now, since we have no readouts, and since Trump himself has still not provided, as at the time I'm talking, his own true social account of his conversation with Zelensky, I can't verify this, but Ukrainian sources are apparently saying that Trump told Zelensky that Putin told Trump that the only way forward, the only way towards peace, is for the Ukrainians to start shifting ground and start to move towards the position set out in Russia's memorandum. Now, that is undoubtedly true, and as I said previously, it has essentially been confirmed by Peskov, and that Trump apparently told Zelensky that Zelensky, in light of the current situation, needed to start thinking about doing that very thing. Now, perhaps, quite possibly, that was indeed what Trump did say, that in effect he was passing on to Zelensky the bad news from Putin, that Putin is not prepared to agree to a ceasefire. He insists on the Russian terms being met, and that Zelensky really does need to start engaging with the Russians on those terms. Well, I don't know what Zelensky said in response. I can't believe that Zelensky is going to shift position on the substance. His position is now so publicly identified with an adamantine refusal to make any concessions to the Russians on the terms that Putin is demanding, that I think it would be politically impossible for Zelensky to agree to any part of the Russian terms and remain president. And besides, I don't get the sense that Zelensky himself has any inclination or intention of doing anything like this. But apparently, under heavy pressure from Trump, he did reverse himself. He's previously said that he could see no purpose or point in the current negotiation process with the Russians. He saw no further point in turning up to further meetings in Istanbul or having his negotiators turn up to further meetings in Istanbul, to meeting an increasingly tough and hard Medinsky and the other equally tough and hard Russian negotiators. But apparently, over the course of this conversation, if these Ukrainian reports are true, he did agree that he would do precisely that he would again send negotiators to meet with the Russians in Istanbul, and that would happen at some point over the course of this month. Well, we shall see. As to the last, I want to stress that this is all based upon rumour and hearsay and informed information from people in Ukraine. I was not obviously party to the call between Trump and Zelensky. It does seem to me quite plausible that Trump did pass on that message to Zelensky. If so, he has in effect done something like what I suggested Western leaders should be doing, which I set out in my last two programs, pointing out to Zelensky the impossible situation in which Ukraine now finds itself in, and urging him finally to face the reality and to negotiate peace. But then, of course, it looks as if Trump did so in the mildest way, making it most unlikely that Zelensky will listen, and coming back to Keir Starmer and Macron's coalition of the willing, Merz's various interventions. It looks as if the Ukrainians are still continuing to get completely contradictory advice from the Europeans, who are continuing to tell them that they should stand firm because Europe is right behind them, even though in reality and in fact there is nothing Europe can practically do. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, where we are with these discussions between Zelensky, Trump and Merz, which took place yesterday. We continue to be in a situation where there are no American missiles, air defense missiles being supplied to Ukraine, and the Russians are continuing their attacks. Now, the previous attack, the one that I discussed in my program yesterday, turns out to have been the single biggest attack that the Russians have made, night attack that the Russians have made with drones and missiles against Ukraine on any particular night. There's been some pushback against claims that the Russians are able to launch 500 Iran drones against Ukraine on any particular night. It said that they might be able to do that from time to time, but that they cannot do it continuously. Well, they have been doing it over the last couple of nights, and the night before last, the number of drones, Iran drones, that were launched was well in excess, apparently, of 500. And of course, they were backed by missiles, by Iskander missiles. And coming back to the question of the Patriot missile interceptors that Zelensky is so earnestly begging for, and which the Merz is begging for also. One of the most astonishing comments made over the last 24 hours was by Yuri Ignat, the actually very honest and very capable. I believe he's a man of genuine integrity. He doesn't always tell the truth. He's on occasion been told to tell things which are obvious, pure fantasy. But every so often he blurts out the truth. Anyway, Yuri Ignat, the spokesperson of Ukraine's Air Force. And Ignat, who has already recently admitted that the F-16s are no match to the Russian fighter jets. He now also admitted that the Patriot missiles, in effect, are ineffective against the more advanced Iskander-M missiles that the Russians are using. That these missiles are now very advanced, that they carry out complex maneuvers, that the Patriots are unable to overcome this problem, so that when the Russians do launch Iskander-Ms, as they do practically every night now, the production line of these missiles must be very impressive. Anyway, when the Russians launch these missiles, and by the way, I've noticed that the Ukrainians are quietly dropping their claims that they're intercepting Kinjal hypersonic missiles, which are in effect a variant of the Iskander, the ground-launched Iskander. Anyway, Ignat basically is saying that when the Russians use these missiles, there is nothing very much that the Ukrainians can do, that these missiles will evade the Patriots and will get through. And there's been other complaints from the Ukrainians. They're now saying that the special ammunition for the relatively few Gepard anti-aircraft tanks that the Germans provided them with, which are, by the way, quite old, is now basically run out. That Beziglaya is saying that the electronics of these systems, which must be quite old, by the way, are rarely switched on when they are used at all. And one would assume that it was the Gepards that the Ukrainians would be using most in trying to shoot down the Geran drones. And by the way, there was an extraordinary and rather pathetic article, pathetic in terms of the behavior of what it was describing, rather. A sad article, if you like, in the BBC. A BBC correspondent went to see a Ukrainian team based in Sumy region who were given the task of shooting down Geran drones, and it turned out that they were equipped with Maxim submachine guns from the First World War. This is the famous Maxim guns that were in fact developed in the 1880s and which first the Imperial Russian Army put into production and which were heavily used by the Russians during the First World War, and then which were used also by the Bolsheviks, by the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and which continued to be used by the Red Army during the Second World War. It is, by the way, still, I understand, a powerful machine gun and a very reliable one. But it is an extremely old weapon. And it wasn't identified, by the way, but I saw that there was a picture, there was an accompanying picture, and I identified it. Presumably, this has been taken out of old Red Army stocks still in Ukraine. Anyway, they are using these machine guns to try to shoot down the Geran drones, except it was clear that the Geran drones fly too high and too fast. There doesn't seem to be any radar control to assist these gunners. And frankly, from what I could see, they were shooting into the air and the drones were flying by. One could hear them come because of the motorcycle sound that their propeller engines make, but they flitted by on their way to Kiev. And from what I could tell from the article, not a single one of these drones was actually successfully shot down. Anyway, it was a curious article in the BBC. One wonders who it was in Ukraine who took the decision to allow the BBC correspondent to see these forlorn Ukrainian air defense troops trying to shoot down the Gerans at all. Anyway, the Gerans flying on to Kiev, also, by the way, apparently sometimes striking targets in Sumy region. But it's clear that the Ukrainians are becoming overwhelmed, and there is no reason to think that these attacks from the Russians, these night attacks from the Russians, are going to stop. My own understanding is that the factory in Kazan, which now makes those Geran drones, is still far from working close to capacity. And I understand that there's been at least one other factory set up to produce these drones. And there are rumors that North Korean workers have been enlisted to make those drones, either in North Korea itself or perhaps more plausibly somewhere in Russia. There are suggestions that 1,000 Geran drones could be launched against Ukraine every night by the end of this year. I do not think that this is a fantastic number, given the type of drone that we are talking about, even the more sophisticated variants of these drones with jet engines and bigger warheads and more sophisticated control mechanisms are going to be relatively cheap and very straightforward to produce, and to produce in quantity by Russia's enormous military industries. And I suspect that we're going to see more and more of these drones every night, and that the trend is simply going to go on going upward. And the same is true of fab bombs and missiles of various varieties as well. Incidentally, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, who overall supervises Russian military industries and who appears to have some sort of role in managing the recruitment process, says that something like 220,000 men have joined the Russian military this year. He predicts that the total number this year of men who are enlisting in the Russian military will be somewhere around 500,000. Simplicius the thinker has pointed out that many of these men enlist for relatively short periods of around 6 months. They again get paid good wages for the time that they're in the military, then they go back to civilian life. There is a constant churn. Some men do enlist for longer periods, some for much longer periods as well. And it's likely, when we're talking about the churn, that many of these people who enlist and then drop out are then the people who re-enlist again, and that we are seeing a gradually increasing cycle, a number of Russian troops in the reserves. Whatever the facts here, it's obvious that all claims that the Russian military is short of men and machines is wrong. On the contrary, the number of men is increasing, the number of machines is also increasing. The Russians have an abundance of both. If you want to go to someone who discusses this kind of thing well, apart from Simplicius the thinker, another person who discusses this in an authoritative way is, of course, Andrei Martyanov. Anyway, let's move on. So all of this is happening, and the Russians continue to land heavy punches on the front lines. The Ukrainians are now in something bordering on panic, or so I'm told, about the latest incursion by the Russian army into Kharkiv region along a completely new area of the border. There are also reports that the Russians, having now pushed the Ukrainians away from Totkino in Kursk region, have crossed the border into Sumy region there as well, in the area of Totkino, and that they're enlarging their forces, and there's suggestions that the Russians are preparing to advance on Sumy, the city of Sumy, from a completely different direction. There's also more reports about the Russians making further advances after having repelled Ukrainian counterattacks in the Liman area, and of them enlarging the area they control around Siversk. The big events, however, continue to happen in the Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka and western Donbass area. There are claims that the Russians have achieved another breakthrough south of Chasiv Yar in the Konstantinovka area, one which further tightens the lid on the cauldron in which a significant number of Ukrainian troops are now in effect trapped. I'm not sure that this is true, but it does apparently appear to have been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry. There are also reports that the Russians now control 98% of the metropolitan area of Chasiv Yar. There's only apparently 2% left to capture. I'm not sure how these numbers are calculated. If that is correct, then Chasiv Yar, the whole metropolitan area of Chasiv Yar, might pass under Russian control, literally from 1 hour to the next. Just saying. A Ukrainian officer is apparently now publicly complaining about the encirclement of Pakrovsk because of the Russian advances northeast of Pakrovsk. He's apparently written to say that the Ukrainian forces in Pakrovsk are desperately short of infantry, and unless more infantry is urgently redeployed to Pakrovsk, then the garrison that is holding Pakrovsk and Mirnograd will indeed be not just encircled, but in effect trapped as well. What happened, in fact, was that some weeks ago, Syrskyi and Zelensky transferred a significant number of forces from Sumy region to hold back the Russians in Konstantinovka and Pakrovsk. Those troops arrived in Konstantinovka and Pakrovsk. That never stopped the Russian advance, but it did slow it down to a certain extent. But then that made it possible for the Russians to accelerate their advances in Sumy region. So then that began to become dangerous. So the Ukrainians sent their forces, the forces that they'd redeployed to Konstantinovka and Pakrovsk, back to Sumy region to try to contain the Russian advances there. And that has now enabled the Russians to accelerate their advances in Pakrovsk and Konstantinovka again, even as they're now starting more attacks in other parts of the front line along the border, clearly with the purpose, so far as I can see, of stretching the Ukrainians even further. The real crisis, maybe, is now happening in Western Donbass. Again, I'm not going to pretend I'm fully up to date with this, but I'm hearing that Ukrainian telegram channels are starting to panic about the situation in Western Donbass, in Dnipropetrovsk region. They're saying that the Russian forces there are advancing, that it is indeed turning into a kind of steamroller, that there is no stopping the Russians in this area, that the Ukrainian defenses are fragmented and disorganized, and that again the Ukrainians are too short of infantry and have inadequate fortified lines to fall back on, which enables the Russians to advance not just one village at a time in this area, but multiple villages at a time. And that the situation in this area between Western Donbass and the Dnieper itself is now in progressive collapse. I've said already, this is perhaps the point of decision. I've said many times, if the Russians reach the Dnieper in the central area, if they're able to invest and indeed capture the city of Zaporozhye and perhaps Dnipro as well, then militarily speaking, it is game over for Ukraine. Perhaps we're closer to that point than many people realize if these reports about panic on the part of the Ukrainians is true. Anyway, I've already, in my program yesterday, spoke about the urgency for Ukraine to resume negotiations, serious negotiations, to start to make the difficult but unavoidable transition, if Ukraine is to survive, towards negotiating with the Russians based on the Russians' terms. It looks as if, or it may be the case, that this is what Donald Trump has finally urged Zelensky and the Ukrainians to do. Though, to repeat again, I am not sure of this. It seems to me that if Keir Starmer, in what I suspect is his final weeks or months as Prime Minister of Britain, finally does want to do something which is useful for Ukraine, that is, he could add his voice to Trump's and urge Zelensky to do the same thing. He's not going to, nor is Macron, nor are any of them. But, well, as I always say, better to point out that options exist than to continue with the fiction that they don't. Now, before I finish this video, I want to say a few things about the situation between the United States and Iran, because there are reports coming out of the United States, again, that the Iranians have now agreed to a further meeting with the United States to discuss their enrichment program, and that this meeting could take place soon, in a few weeks, in a few days, in fact. Now, it could very well be that this is indeed the case, but just a few days ago, the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, as I discussed on one of these programs, said that the Iranians are not prepared to engage the Americans in substantive negotiations unless they get guarantees from the Americans that the United States is not going to attack Iran again whilst the negotiations are underway, and that the United States presumably will restrain Israel also from doing so. Now, according to the Tasnim news agency, Iran's deputy foreign minister, Majid Takht Ravanchi, essentially confirmed this in an interview on Thursday. He said to NBC News that the United States inflicted serious damage to Iran's nuclear facilities during a naked act of aggression on the 21st of June. And he said that as long as there is no further act of aggression being perpetrated by the United States against us, we will not respond again beyond the missile strikes against the American bases that already took place. But then he went on to say this: how can we trust the Americans? We want them to explain as to why they misled us, why they took such an egregious action against our people. Iran remains open to dialogue. We are for diplomacy. We are for dialogue. But the United States needs to convince us that they are not going to use military force whilst we are negotiating. This is an essential element for our leadership to be in a position to decide about the future round of talks. Our policy has not changed on enrichment. Iran has every right to do enrichment within its territory. The only thing that we have to observe is not to go for militarization. So it doesn't seem to me that the public position of the Iranians has changed. I suspect that if there is going to be a meeting between Iran and the United States at some point over the next few weeks or days even, then the Iranians will go there and will try to engage the United States, presumably Steve Witkoff, in negotiations, not about the enrichment process as such, but about these guarantees that Iran says it is now seeking. to prevent a similar American attack on Iran again. Now, how that will play out, I'm not even going to try to guess. The Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister, Ravanchi, he said, how can we trust the Americans? What kind of guarantee, presumably, are they going to provide us with? And I've already said I find it very difficult to understand that myself. But anyway, we will see. There is an outside possibility, given the balance of opinions in Iran, that the Iranians might nonetheless drop that condition and might agree to resume negotiations with the United States, specifically about their enrichment program. I think if they did that, it would be interpreted both in the United States and Israel as an act of weakness. I don't myself think that that is what the Iranians are going to do. But I have to say, and I have to repeat this again, because of the divisions and arguments that do seem to take place within the Iranian leadership, if the Iranians were to do that, to resume negotiations on their enrichment program without obtaining even paper guarantees, token guarantees from the United States, it would not, I have to say, entirely surprise me. In the meantime, Pezeshkian, the Iranian president, has gone to Azerbaijan. There was a meeting there. He wasn't just there to meet Aliyev and the other Azerbaijani leaders. There was a larger, wider meeting there. Pezeshkian speaks Turkish and is able to speak to Aliyev in Aliyev's own language. I wonder whether the recent decision by the Azerbaijani authorities to grant access to Russian diplomats to the various people that the Azerbaijanians arrested, the Russian journalists, that the Azerbaijani journalists arrested, might in some way be connected to that. But then, of course, I don't know. So anyway, a lot going on there. Lastly, Russia, acting in its usual pragmatic way, has now established formal diplomatic relations with the Taliban in Afghanistan and has established diplomatic relations with the Taliban and has recognized them as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. I expect that before long, China will do the same. And you can find an interesting account of this, which has been passed on to me, by the way, just to acknowledge this, by Eve Smith from Horizon Geopolitics. It discusses the reasons why the Russians have done that. It's an interesting discussion. There are a few points that I don't entirely agree with in this article, but it does provide a good overview. And its title is Russia Recognizes Taliban, Game Changer in Central Asia. Moscow's bold move reshapes Central Asia's balance, boosts Eurasian integration, and redefines state legitimacy in the post-US order. Well, there we are. This is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Remember that you can buy all those amazing things with the names of cities in our shop. And links, of course, under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.